What's up, folks? BCSG here with another episode of the Fishing 101 series. Now, this particular episode I was not going to record. It's about bait casting reels and how to set it up. And I had not initially planned to include this in the Fishing 101. For no particular reason, I just didn't think that it would make very interesting content. Maybe it's a bit too common content. But in the last few months, to my surprise, it's not only been requested by you folks at home, it's been pretty heavily requested. You know, dude, can you do a video on how to set up a bait casting reel? Can you do a video on how to set up a bait finesse reel? Or just how do you do it? How do you do it? You know, and so a lot of you have asked me that enough to tell me that, okay, all right, I'll make a video on it. So what I have here is my Shimano Scorpion 1500 XT. Okay, this is a full size or what I call a regular size bait casting reel. Now, for those of you who have asked me from a bait finesse perspective and wondering why I'm using a regular size reel, well, it's quite simple. It's still a bait casting reel. The basics of setting the reel up are identical, regardless of what kind of bait casting genre you're using. The basics of a bait casting reel is still the same. Still has the same parts. It has the brake, it has the spool tension, and it has the spool. Right? Okay. Some may have two different forms of brakes. You know, both centrifugal and magnetic. Most have either centrifugal or magnetic. So, getting right into it, let's approach this as someone who is completely brand new to bait casting, because most of the questions, most of the requests for this video have led with, I'm new to bait casting, I'm trying to get into bait casting, can you do a video on how to set up a reel? So assuming you are new, if you're not new and you already know how to use a bait caster, you can kind of skip this video because you're not going to learn anything new. This is just a basic setup instructional video. What I like to tell most folks who ask me in person is, if you want to learn how to use a bait caster, don't expect to be fishing the bait caster the first time you go out. Meaning, don't expect to buy a bait caster, never have casted one before, go out on the water, spool it up, and expect to get a great session fishing just like a spinning reel would. It's just not going to happen. Bait casting has a learning curve, and it can be pretty unpleasant if you've never used one before. If you just did that. For the first 5 sessions out with a bait caster, don't even really think about getting much actual fishing in. Alright, and you'll slowly understand why I say that as we go along. First thing is line choice. Alright, a lot of people get put off bait casting reels because they choose the wrong line in which to learn to cast on, or they set up the reel wrongly from a line perspective. Always, as far as possible, try to learn how to cast your bait casting reel with monofilament or fluorocarbon line. Few reasons. One of them is monofilament and most fluorocarbon tend to be cheaper than braided line, especially monofilament. Monofilament lines are ridiculously cheap. Fluorocarbon can get really expensive. Some braids, even the cheapest ones, don't even compare to the price of monofilament line. And some braids are really expensive, not to mention most fuse lines are expensive. So always consider starting off with monofilament. First reason is the price. The second reason is because monofilament lines are easier to manage when you get a backlash. Okay, they are thicker, they are a bit stiffer, so therefore they're easier to manage. When you get a backlash, essentially the spool spins faster than the line is leaving the spool. So what happens is the line starts backing up on itself and starts bunching up. Okay, so you just think about it. You take a piece of thread and you bunch it up and really, kind of mix that up, versus you take a piece of monofilament and you did the same thing, which is going to be easier for you to take out. I mean, assuming you could eventually undo both messes, which is going to be easier. The monofilament is always going to be easier. So price, line management, two primary reasons why you should always learn to cast a baitcaster using monofilament. The second tip when it comes to line choice or line in general is do not completely fill the spool with line. Now I understand that with bait finesse reels they come with shallow spools, but with traditional reels they come with deep spools. Do not fill the entire spool with line. If you're new to bait casting, you probably won't get much further than a 25 to 35 meter cast. Remember, you're not supposed to be going out and fishing the first few times you use a bait caster. You're supposed to be learning how to use it because there's a learning curve. So put on only enough line for you to make a decently long cast. Why? Well, you're gonna get backlashes almost every cast for probably the first 20 casts. And if you fill the entire spool with line, let's say your spool can handle 120 meters of 10 pound or 12 pound monofilament, right? And then you take that full spool and you go out there and you're like, all right, let's see if I can figure this out, and you cast and you get a huge backlash from that. That backlash is going to eat all the way into the spool, or at least has the potential of doing that, and you're going to end up just wasting your time digging that backlash out and wasting money at that. If you only spooled 35 meters, 25 meters of line, well, that's the worst backlash you're ever going to get. And a 25 meter backlash is really easy to take out. You can't backlash that deep into the spool because it's just not much line. So you've gotten that 25-35 meters of line, you put the spool into the reel. The first thing is to set up the spool tension. Every bait caster has a spool tension knob, with the exception of some very specific Daiwa models that I'm not familiar with, because I'm not familiar with Daiwa. So for those of you who are using Daiwa reels, you're probably gonna have to Google it and figure out which reel has adjustable spool tension and which one doesn't. For everyone else, spool tension knob is first. If you take a look right here, my spool tension is a bit loose right now, so when the spool tension is loose, that spool can slide left to right. Step one is to adjust the spool tension such that the spool no longer shifts left to right. Now you don't want to just tighten it blindly all the way down. You want to keep shifting that spool, slowly tighten. You see that movement is getting less now. Slowly tighten a little more, movement getting even less, and there's no more movement. And that's where you stop. Now, many beginner instructional videos and articles about bait casting reels will tell you to adjust your spool tension to the lure that you're using. The most common phrase is adjust the spool tension such that the lure falls slowly to the ground, such that when it hits the ground, the spool stops spinning together with it. I get the logic behind that, but I completely disagree with it. The brakes are there for a reason, and that is to manage your line. You shouldn't be using your spool tension to manage the line. The only scenario in which I use my spool tension knob to manage line is when it gets particularly windy and I still want to get good distance. Right? That's when I set the brakes just enough to manage the wind, and I set the spool tension a little bit tighter to give me that end of cast line management. So that still allows me to get very good distance. I don't have to overset my centrifugal brakes to compromise the distance. I set it at a decent level, not too much. I adjust the spool tension to make up for that wind resistance towards the end of the cast. That is the only situation in which I touch my spool tension knob outside of this setting. Okay, so now that you've adjusted your spool tension, we move on to brakes. There are two types of brakes generally when you're talking about bait casting reels. You have centrifugal brakes, you have magnetic brakes. I personally like centrifugal brakes more. Some people like magnetic brakes more. It's really personal preference. The primary difference is magnetic brakes gets you better distance, but it tends to require a smoother casting stroke. Centrifugal brakes kind of allows you to screw up a little. you can literally just whip it out there with a centrifugal brake reel, right? And you won't get a backlash if you set your brakes properly, because that's how centrifugal brakes work. The faster the spool spins, the more brake force is applied to the spool exponentially, and therefore the maximum spool speed is severely limited. So, two types of brakes. How do you set the brakes? Magnetic brakes, I always tell folks, turn that all the way to 10. If your reel is a magnetic brake reel and you're new to bait casting and you've done the spooling very little line, spooling monofilament, adjusted the spool tension, go ahead and turn your magnetic brakes all the way to 10 or all the way to max, whatever the maximum is. If you're using a centrifugal brake reel like most Shimano reels, or any other brand for that matter that uses centrifugal brakes, what I have found is typically 50% or 75% of the maximum setting is often enough to help you manage a beginner casting session with centrifugal brakes. Alright, so now that I've covered most of the basics of setting up the reel, honestly, beyond that, the only thing that you have to remember is thumb to stop, no thumb to go. Thumb to stop, no thumb to go. That's the bare basics, right? You cast, you let go when you cast so that the lure can fly. When the lure hits the water, just before it hits the water, you stop the spool. Stop the spool before the lure hits the water, not when it hits the water, and definitely not after. It's always better to thumb the spool early than it is to thumb the spool late. Making a short cast and gradually learning how to lengthen that cast is much easier than thumbing the spool late and having to sort out a backlash every single cast, alright? Okay, so the second most important tip, it has to do with casting. This is probably, of all the casting tips I have, this is probably the most important one. Always start off with an overhead cast. Alright, a lot of folks will tell you to start off with a side cast because that's easier to manage, and overhead casting is actually tougher. I have found that overhead casting is actually easier to learn on. Alright, all you need to remember is cast up. Look up, 45 degrees, pick a dot in the sky, and you cast towards that dot. And keep your eye on the lure. Okay? What you're gonna find is when you're casting upwards, it suddenly becomes very easy to manage a cast. It's very difficult to screw up a cast if you're casting up. It's really easy to screw up a cast if you're casting forward. It's also pretty easy to screw up a cast if you're casting from the side. Alright? If you're casting forward, what is the problem? You screw it up, the lure just goes straight down. If you're casting from the side, what's the problem? You screw it up, the lure flies this way or it flies that way. If you're casting up, the lure can only fly one way. It only flies up. Alright? And at the worst, if you screw it up, the lure is going to fly straight if you let go too late. If you let go too early, it's still going to fly up. So, always look up and start casting upwards first. Another benefit of casting up is it gives you a lot of hang time. Alright, that lure is going to spend more time in the air. And the longer the lure spends in the air, the more time you have to, with your eyes, find that lure flying in mid-air and track it. And the more time you have to react as the lure is falling to the ground, the more time you have to practice when to thumb the spool. And that also gives you the opportunity to learn how to feather the spool, which feathering the spool means, alright, so if you have the spool spinning like that, alright, thumbing the spool like this stops it. If you're having the spool spinning like that, feathering the spool slows it down. Okay, so that's what feathering the spool means. And you're not going to have much time to feather the spool or to learn how to feather a spool if you're casting pretty much horizontal. You're not going to have much time. The lure's going to fly straight and drop. If you're casting up, you have plenty of time to learn everything. Oh, I screwed up the cast, I can't find the lure, where's the lure, where's the lure? Ah, found it, okay, thumb the spool. If you're casting from the side, and you happen to lose track of the lure, you're going to get a backlash almost instantly. So, I guess this probably concludes the video a bit abruptly, but that's really all I think I need to talk about when it comes to setting up and learning how to cast a baitcaster for the first time. So once again, I'm going to go through everything from the start really quickly. Line choice should preferably be monofilament or fluorocarbon. Monofilament because it's cheap. Only spool enough line for a decently long cast, which I find is usually 25 to 35 meters or 10% more in yards. Adjust the spool tension such that the spool stops moving and no more than that. If you're using magnetic brakes, turn that to the limit, and as you get better, you can slowly back off the brakes. If you're using a centrifugal brake reel, set that to about 75% of the limit, and likewise, as you get better, you can back off the brakes. Start learning to cast by casting upwards, 45 degrees at least, and look up when you're casting. Do not look at your reel when you're casting. You know, don't do this. No, look up. All right, just do this, like that, 45 degrees up. Okay, because if you're looking at the reel or you're trying to track the lure when you're casting it, I guarantee you 8 out of 10 times you're going to lose sight of the lure. Okay, so look front, 45 degrees up and cast upwards, track the lure, slowly thumb the spool as it hits the ground. And I hope all these tips help you guys. Try it out. I have found that this is the easiest and most effective way to learn how to use a bait caster and to set one up. Some folks might disagree with me. You know, if you disagree, didn't like this tip, give me a thumbs down. You know, it's engagement anyway, right? And it tells me that you disagree with me, and there's nothing wrong with that. But if you did like this tip video, this 101 video, give me a thumbs up. Share it with your friends if you found it helpful. And I'll catch you guys in the next video. Tight lines.